This is a great time to be talking about M&A, and this is a fun webinar. So this is called How to Sell a Business. It's a step-by-step guide, and this is going to be done in two parts. This is the first part. We'll be doing the second part next week. This is hosted by Financial LOIs. You can see them within the deck, information on them, and all of their great educational content. Our panelists today are myself, Tom Goldblatt. I'm managing partner of Ravinia Capital, which is an investment bank. Phil Buffington, a partner at Balch and Bingham. I hope I didn't mispronounce that. Jonathan Friedland, a partner at Much Shellist. And Greg Lavin, an investment banker, managing director at Whipley LLP. As I said, my name's Tom Goldblatt. And you can see our names on slide 5 of the deck, and you can read our bio starting on slide 51. Neither Financial LOIs nor we intend to be an infomercial, so you don't have to listen to me read bios. If you want more information about it, just look at the slides. And about the slides, I'll try to call your attention that slides that are relevant to whatever we are talking about. So you can take notes if you like, but don't worry if you're listening but not watching this webinar, we'll just be fine because the slides are not critical. If there's a co-producer, there's none. So Financial LOIs webinar are supported by our sponsors. The sponsors of this webinar are Max. Hold on a second. See them, but it's Max Assets. If you need to conduct an online auction, Max Assets is your turnaround solution. Mood, the nation's premier online retail cannabis dispensary. More information in the slide deck. And we will start moving, although I think that National Law Review also was the co-producer, which I failed to mention. Okay, so let's see. Without further ado, here we go. So the first thing we're going to start off is at the very beginning, and it's going to be what are the reasons for selling a business? And I'll kind of address that, and other panelists could jump in. But some of the most common reasons are an owner retiring, burnt out, health issues, succession, no succession, wanting to cash out with private equity. Private equity firms themselves have a limited time that they like to hold companies. Could be a dispute going on. It could be a distress situation where the only way to get the needed liquidity is to kind of have a new owner who might find synergistic reasons to own the business. Could be that the business has capital restraints. Or it could be that an offer is made unsolicited. We don't think that's a good idea to accept those type of offers, but that is a reason that a lot of people think about selling. Any other panelists have anything to supplement those for reasons for selling before we move on?
Yeah, Tom, one other reason that I would kind of maybe include in here is, I agree with your comment on, an unsolicited offer. Usually that kind of starts the process of maybe getting the owner to think about what is the succession for the business and the planning needing to occur. But I always like to say one buyer is not always the best solution. But we also see, clients look at the competitive landscape a little bit. And sometimes as businesses scale, they have more access to technology. They have more access to capital. They have more access to, a stronger infrastructure. And if the business feels like it's becoming less competitive and that things are changing rapidly, and you're seeing a lot of acquisitions in the space where the space is consolidating their environment, that may be another reason why acquisitions should be considered. And we see a lot of that in financial institutions.
Yep, thanks, Greg. And whatever the reason is, and there's many different reasons, it's important that people do this right. It's not a small thing, and it's something that owners don't do frequently. And I think the purpose of this webinar is to kind of provide some best practices, because we find that it makes a huge difference whether you run a proper process or just an improper one, which could lead to either a lower value or a broken up deal. So we'll step right into this. And Phil, this question is going to go to you. What are the first steps a business owner should take when they decide to sell their business?
Well, I think y'all already touched on one of the first things you need to do is, and that's really determine why you're wanting to sell. If you've got a distressed business, you've got a different set of factors you'll need to look at. If you're trying to retire, there's a different set of factors you'll need to look at. If it's just an unsolicited offer, there'll be some other things. But I think the best thing you can do, and again, this would be more applicable in a regulated industry, but always consider those options on probably an annual basis. If we were approached by a buyer, are we ready to sell? Be prepared. And I think that's really important, because a lot of times people get really tied up in running their business and just working on the day-to-day or big picture items, and they don't think about unsolicited offers or things happening that require to sell. For example, the death of a key employee. You know, what do you have to do then? Is there going to be a forced sale because of that? But make sure that you've got your business streamlined. Make sure that you're increasing your profits. If you can reduce your expenses, if you're planning on selling, I think the more you can create a positive scenario for the financial side of your business, the better off you're going to be in trying to sell that business, because whoever's going to buy it is going to come in and do a deep dive on, well, let me back up. Whoever is going to buy it should come in and do a deep dive on due diligence to determine what they're buying. And so you've got a lot of that going on there.
Yep.
The other thing is just make sure you're marketing it. I think Greg mentioned it just briefly, but don't just take the first offer. I mean, a lot of times people will jump the gun because they think this is a great offer.
Yeah.
A great offer, then chances are there are other offers out there that might be equally as good or better.
Yeah, those are great answers, Phil. And those are a lot of things you've hit on that we'll kind of get to. But I would say that, you know, echoing what you said, as a first step before it is to make sure that they're really serious about it. You know, this is not a minor thing. It's going to be a long process, and you don't want to kind of go in this kind of wishy-washy, let's just put it up and see what kind of happens. You got to be committed to it, and you have to realize that people are going to be looking very closely at it, and they don't like uncertainty. And, you know, so things that you can kind of help improve before you get going are very important. Getting into a little, go ahead.
Overlay.
John.
So you just sort of segued things you can improve. So unless the need to sell arises fairly unexpectedly, assuming that is that your business is running along, chugging along, and you're looking at whatever you're looking at, your age, your health, your whatever. You say, look, I think I want to get ready to sell this in the next year or 2 or 3. That's the time to start planning. And depending on the sophistication of the business, and there's legal housekeeping, there's financial housekeeping, there's things that can be done to increase to use a simple analogy, the curb appeal of selling a house. You might put a fresh coat of paint on it. I'm talking a little bit more substantive in the context of selling a company, but legal housekeeping, ensuring that contracts and licenses and various corporate documents are in order, making sure to normalize earnings if you can, getting a preliminary valuation. You don't want to burn a lot of time if you know that you're not willing to sell below X because the cash flow of the business gives you a particular lifestyle. And if indications of preliminary valuation tell you can't get anywhere near what you want, then don't do it.
I'm not, I find a lot of times, sometimes people put a little bit too much credence in formal valuations at this early stage, because I think really you can get kind of a rough idea, but every company is unique. And you're really not going to know, but you can give them a certain range of values. And you're right, their expectations need to be in line, or it's probably not a good idea. But I think maybe purchasing a valuation in a lot of cases is not really necessary. It's more a broad range.
Well, and
Go
along those lines, Tom, just two quick points.
Yeah.
You know, generally speaking, business hygiene, making sure your business looks its best in every area, like Jonathan said, and like both of y'all, Tom and Greg, both of y'all said. But I do think it's important that even if you're not considering selling, that you consider those issues on a regular or annual basis, so you're prepared if the event comes up. I find a lot of
Great.
people that aren't prepared for the process, and even having a small discussion about it at the board level, or if it's closely held corporation at the shareholder level, or even at a large level, making sure you're prepared for the process.
Great points, Phil. So let's go to this next. The next question is going to be for Greg. And what financial records and metrics should business owners focus on improving to make their business more attractive to potential buyers?
Yeah, I always say when you're going through this process, it is a tough, grueling process. You want to always put your best foot forward. So, it starts with your financials and the trends the business is experiencing. Hey, are the financial statements, are they prepared by an outside accountant? Are you receiving audits, reviews, or compilations? Or are you just getting a tax return? So what is the quality of the financial statements that are being presented? But then also really know your key performance indicators that are common in the industry. So as you talk with strategics or financial buyers alike, they want to know, hey, is your gross profit margin appropriate? Looking at your margins, other key performance indicators, I think is very, very key to the process in terms of tracking those. But then, it goes back to the housekeeping. How well are you taking care of your customers and the customer contracts? Have they been updated? Have their files been maintained? How well have you been taking care of your employees? Do they have employment agreements? Do they have non-compete agreements? So when you look at the financial records, you also got to look at the employment records. Are they all properly documented employees? How is your payroll being processed? And then also back to the accounting issue, taxation. Big area of diligence, state and local taxes, payroll compliance. Are they an employee? Are they an independent contractor? There's a whole bunch of considerations, legal, financial, and operational, that you want to make sure that you maintain.
Right.
For a business that maintains inventory, and I'll open this up to the group after I talk about that, make sure your inventory records are clean. Make sure that you've done a physical inventory. Make sure you reviewed for obsolescence and slow moving inventory, because that will be a major topic of discussion, during due diligence, but also pre-due diligence as you're talking to parties.
Yeah, great points. Anybody else want to add anything related to financial records and metrics that owners should focus on improving before to make their attractive to potential buyers?
One thing I would suggest, and a lot of industries have this, is look at your peer group numbers, whatever your peers are doing, and compare yourself to those peer numbers to really see where you fall in the realm of how good of a business you're running within your peers. I know, like for financial institutions, they all have peer group numbers, and a lot of industries have those.
Excellent point. And I think the point Greg was making is it later on in the process, at the beginning, you have leeway, but everything is going to be looked at, and you're not going to be able to hide anything. And so the sooner things kind of come out and get fixed, the better, so that they don't end up being deal killers later or reasons for somebody to trade down. If you have sloppy financials, that you're going to really have trouble getting very far with a sale. Also, people start looking most closely at the current numbers, and so if you start early enough, it's really good to clean up. And like if you have late receivables to write them off, if you have certain credits to kind of push them into prior periods as much as possible. So the year of your sale is going to be as clean as possible. If you have outstanding legal things, it's good to get them settled, whether you're getting sued by somebody or you're suing somebody. Buyers don't like uncertainty. So the more certainty is going to be better. I'm going to go to the next question. It's going to go to Jonathan, and it's, what are some legal pitfalls that business owners often overlook when preparing to sell their business, and how can these be addressed ahead of time?
I'm gonna lean into what you just said about uncertainty. So, and I'll give you a few examples. A lot of companies, particularly companies where it's led by the founder as opposed to the company was purchased by somebody, the cap table's often kind of messed up. Shareholder agreements or member agreements are missing. So ownership structure has got to be buttoned down. Contracts. If you've got unassignable or expiring contracts, you're going to want to try to renegotiate, obtain consents as the case may be, consents for assignment as the case may be. IP. A lot of companies rely on IP. Sometimes their assignment documents to the rights of that IP, I have found, are not always buttoned up. Oh, another one is non-competes and retention agreements for critical employees. Sometimes you're selling your business and the business, it's good business, but it's a great business as long as you keep Tom, Dick, and Harry. Or maybe it's not such a good business at all without Tom, Dick, and Harry. So
Yeah.
you gotta lock those up. Those are the top of my. Oh,
You know what? Well, go ahead. You have one more?
I was gonna say liability, hidden liabilities. If you're sitting on a piece of land that has an environmental problem, if there's employment litigation, tax issues, things like that a seller might not always think of bringing to the forefront right away.
Right.
Can really crater a deal if they're not, if they're
We
not
like
until later.
anything, it's not even great, but anything that's going to have kind of a time lag. So an environmental phase one is a good example. Like if there's real estate, you're not going to complete the sale unless you have a phase one done. And that takes, it can take 2 weeks to 6 weeks. And so you don't want to be doing that near the very end, particularly if something comes up in that phase one, you're going to need a phase two, and that can take further. So we like to kind of get as much front loaded as we can so that we can have a better chance of closing quickly, because is what happens in a deal is at the very beginning, the seller has all the leverage and they're going out to a wider number. And as the process goes on, it starts to narrow, and somebody eventually normally gets an LOI with an exclusive. At that time, the leverage changes over to the buyer. And so if they start finding things, or as time goes on, you're very vulnerable because you're pretty out in the open about the sale. So you really want to handle things up front as much as possible so you can close quickly.
I agree. Hey,
Of,
one more legal
yeah.
thing that I'd like to mention, is related party transactions. So, one thing we like to button up before going to market is a lot of times the shareholders may own the real estate and the business, and the real estate may be held in a separate entity, but they may not be paying fair market value rent or whatever. So we like to try to normalize those, make sure they actually have a lease agreement between the family or the shareholders and the company, so that we really identify that asset, because usually that's a large asset as part in tandem with the business. But any sort of related party transactions, and that could also be sometimes shareholders looking to add additional compensation through lease agreements for equipment needs and things of that nature. They may provide that lease. Just making sure those agreements are buttoned up prior to market.
That's right. One thing I'm going to add a discussion here, and it was brought up about employees and making sure that critical employees are kind of signed up. So there's a big issue in every sale that is who is going to know about the sale? Who's going to be on the inner team and when to tell the employees? And what we find is that by the very end of the sale, you're full open kimono with everything, and everybody knows. So they're going to find out. But the question is more at the beginning, and we find a lot of owners are very paranoid about anybody knowing. They think the worst, and everybody's going to start to leave. Customers will leave, vendors will leave. So they want things very quiet, and they don't want to tell anybody. And we find that tends to backfire because employees are going to find out, and you want more in the inner circle, particularly the critical ones, so that they're part of the team, and you can you can kind of get rid of some of these ideas. They have this idea of private equity buyers and just M&A is like watching movies like Wall Street and thinking the worst. And really, it's generally the best because whoever's coming in generally has the most interest in the business. But anybody have thoughts on how to deal with critical employee issues, whether to bring them into the fold, whether to give them an incentive at the beginning or not? These are always kind of strategic issues. It's more of an art than a skill.
It also
Yeah.
enhances the value as well, Tom. If they see that they have a team that's already established, that's eager to work with a new buyer, most private equity firms, as part of the management meetings, will require to meet some of the key employees. So, you want their buy-in, and, the business, it's still, was this published today? The unemployment rate and, the lack of employment is still at a very low level here in the US. It's around 4%. So people are a key commodity, and any buyer, in order to get that best value, you want to have a broad range of key employees that are staying with the company, that have that knowledge. It helps mitigate a little bit of the risk.
Well, Greg, we're going to go back to you here on this. So let's move on to focus on the buyers for a minute. Describe to us the two basic type of buyers.
Yeah, so the two buyers everybody kind of thinks of, and really it kind of, what we're seeing in the market is really four types, but they kind of derive themselves from the two. So the strategics, the first one listed over here, those are your competitors, right? Or folks that you can provide some synergy to, so help them get into a tangent industry or service, or geography. The object there is that a strategic buyer should be able to pay more for the company because they can add more value, and they have some of the infrastructure in place where they can maybe squeeze out more value with the transaction. And then the financial buyer, the most common is the private equity firm or the family office. But the financial buyer could also be a strategic as well. So a lot of private equity, they are investing in emerging companies, and they want them to grow. And by default, sometimes if they have a portfolio company, they are also a hybrid of a financial buyer and a strategic. And what we've been seeing recently is an upsurge of folks really empowering ESOPs, giving the owner another value option, where there are funds that have just been created to really fund these ESOP transactions, where it takes a lot of what used to be risk to the seller, where they were guaranteeing some of the debt, or they were only doing a partial buyout, or doing the sale staggeredly through a period of time because of the lack of funds that the company can raise through the debt markets. More and more funds have been created to fund ESOPs and in essence compete with the financial buyer to empower employee ownership. And we're seeing more transactions explore this option. KKR is probably the most notable that you read about in the Wall Street Journal and others that are really doing a lot with employee ownership. And I think that's a trend to stay. Yeah.
Well, just kind of getting a little bit further into the types of buyers. So there's really, strategic, its competitors, as you mentioned, and then there's private equity, which in the lower middle market has become more and more dominant. But what we're finding is that a lot of times the buyers are actually sort of a hybrid. So they are private equity, but they already own what's called a platform company in the industry, and they're looking for additional add-ons into that. So they're they're not exactly, they're a financial buyer, but they're also have all the advantages of a strategic. A change in the private equity composition is private equity. It's really not been around for that long, and it was more rare, like when Mitt Romney was at Bain Capital in the early 2000s. And now it's very ubiquitous, and there's just lots of them. But there's different stripes of private equity, and what's kind of emerging as a big trend is what's family offices, who are like private equity. They tended to used to invest as limited partners in private equity, but now they're principals in the acquisitions, and they tend to have a longer hold time. So whereas private equity's traditional model has been to sell within 5 years and try to get a 20% return, the family offices are more long-term, wanting to keep it for 20 years or more. Although I would say for all buyer lately, the hold times have been stretched out since we ended COVID, and then the interest rate started to climb. That they've kind of lowered valuations and kind of frozen the market for a great extent. Although there's a tremendous amount of capital waiting to be deployed. We'll go to the next question, and this is going to go to Phil. And what are some things management can do to increase the value of businesses that prepares to approach outside parties? I know we hit on it some, but you can kind of name some more things.
We did. We've hit on several things, but a couple of things that I would add to that is really concentrate on your revenue streams and your expenses and make sure that's in order. I think that drives value to the bottom line. I think it was Jonathan that mentioned some deferred maintenance earlier. Again, that's a balancing act. Do you spend the money up front and expend the capital to put everything in the best shape, or do you just make sure you disclose it and get it in a way that it doesn't affect the value? How do you set the business apart? What's so special about the business that you're trying to sell that you can really establish your superiority in the market that you're in? Some of the things that I think that we really hadn't touched on or kind of touched on around, I think if you're really trying to drive value, that's the owner needs to know what the risk associated with the business is. And I was going to mention this a minute ago, but I'll mention it here. For example, your supply lines. Is everything in order? I mean, are you going to be able to maintain your supplies to be able to produce your product? The T word, tariffs, are they going to affect your profitability? Know what you've got and know what the risks are and be able to make that risk assessment as you're going through this process. I think that's as important as anything, is being able to assess the risk of your business.
Yeah.
In a position where you can market it with the least amount of risk and can substantiate that lower risk to the buyer. That's
such a great point. I don't know if we're going to get into, valuation right away, but I want to say, Phil, you hit on something that there's a misconception in M&A that the price of the company is based off of the past, and all the fighting is about what was the trailing 12-month EBITDA, the last 12 months. And the fact is that companies are not buying the past, they're buying the future. And the future is harder to measure, but it's based off of two things, really. It's going to be based upon the incremental cash flow that this buyer thinks that this acquisition will add to their existing assets over a long time, discount it back. And the other part of that, and this is what Phil was getting at, it's based off the risk of achieving that. So if the risk is higher because there's some poor accounting that you don't know if those numbers are it, or you haven't kept, your contracts with your employees are sloppy and people might go, or, so the more that risk is high, the less people will value. And so the price of the company, these buyers do their own calculations. They don't share them with you. And they say, well, let's see, this company to us, this would really give us a key market that we need beyond what this company did, or there's a key asset here. it's worth 100 million to us. But then they kind of look at what the company is potentially going to get, and they bid as low as that. So we always say the price of a company is set by $1 higher than the second highest bidder. So it's very important to show that cash flow incrementally, and then that the risk isn't there.
Well,
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Tom. You are buying the future. And, that's where, keeping good records on pipeline, backlog, and that's for both service companies and, production, manufacturing companies. What does their backlog look like? Is that raising or lowering? Phil, you touched on a big uncertainty, tariffs. That has probably been the number one discussion point I've been having for the last 3 weeks or so. Especially if there's Chinese exposure in terms of production as a supplier. How is that impacting their gross margins? What are they doing? Are they able to pass that through? But you cannot discount employees. Key employees, are they bound by a non-compete? And a lot of family businesses, they may have started their business and they say, I really trust Tom. He's worked for me for 30 years. He has like 3 out of our top 5 customer relationships. He's never going to go anywhere. But as an outside buyer, it makes me nervous that Tom may not have a non-compete, especially if he's not a shareholder of the company and is not participating in the sale. So you have to kind of get your arms around that. What does it mean for Tom going forward? Because those are key areas of discussion that you're going to have with any buyer of the corporation going forward.
That's right.
Along those lines too, and I think y'all would agree with this. Sellers don't think about the cost savings and what the economies of scale are as much as the buyer, but that's an important issue for sellers. I mean, know where you're getting that scale. Where's that cost savings going to be? If the buyer's looking at a 15% reduction in expenses to make the merger work or the acquisition work, and you're seeing that it can get 20 or 25%, you need to take that into consideration as you go through this process. So you've got to be financially aware of what the combined company is going to look like, and what ultimately, like y'all are saying, the future of the company, not necessarily the past.
That's
the importance of having multiple buyers reviewing, because each individual buyer has a different profile and a different measure of estimated value for the transaction post-closing. So when Tom said you're really selling the future, the past is a good indicator of what the company can do and how they can perform, but the future is the predictor of where the value can be. And you want to have those matrices and the trends in place to capture the best value.
Let's talk a little bit just about valuation and some common approaches to valuing a company, keeping this at a high level, and share when each is used. Jonathan, are you able to answer this one?
Sure, I am. I'm capable. So, high level, this is kind of 101 stuff. That's why I'm capable. Income approach, market approach, asset-based approach. Like those are the 3 basic approaches.
All right, you got to go backwards though, because those are jargon. So let's go.
I'm going to give me a moment.
All right.
Give me a moment. All right. So the income approach, also the DCF, discounted cash flow. If your company is strong company, predicted cash flows, then you're probably going to want to use that approach. It's basically like, okay, we're going to make $5 million next year. So we predict, we forecast 6 million the next year, 7 million the year after, 8 million the year after. You apply a discount rate to it. It tells you how much a buyer may want to buy based on the cash flow. I mean, real basic. The market approach, it's useful when there's a lot of peer companies, head-to-head competitors that you can compare. Particularly, and even if you're a private company, if there's a public companies, it's more robust data is available. So let's say you own a 25 location fast food chain, And if you know that uh, that other fast food chains have traded at certain multiples, certain amounts, then you say, all right, well, look, we're kind of similar to them. Let's compare what we're worth by, and then to these other transactions by similar companies that have closed. And around the edges, the people doing the valuation will kind of they'll discuss, well, yeah, they're similar, but here are some differences. So there's adjustments
Mhm.
made for the differences.
Right.
Then the last major valuation approach is the asset-based approach. And that's if you're talking about a very asset-heavy business,
Mhm.
and if you're talking about a distress situation. A lot of times it's the asset-based approach because nobody's willing to pay based on the market approach or the income approach. Or in the case of um, a distressed company, there ain't no income, right? Or it's negative net income. So
Right.
broadly speaking, those are the three approaches that you can buy 2,000-page books that talk about valuation.
Yeah, the excellent answer. I think just as a shorthand, what people use a lot is say, what is the multiple? And the word EBITDA, which used to be a very known just by academics and certain financial people. Now everybody knows EBITDA. Everybody's talking about the multiple at their country club. And I want an 8 multiple, a 10 multiple. And I think that's a little misleading for some of the reasons we said is that there's a lot of things that go into EBITDA is a rough calculation of cash flow, but it doesn't account for things like capital investment. It doesn't count for where there needs to be a lot of a working capital line that's not just an acquisition debt and a multiple. It goes by different businesses. Size matters a lot in this. If you're in a growth industry, a technology industry, you tend to get higher multiples. They do tend to go up and down, but again, a lot of times it's what are you multiplying as your EBITDA? Are you looking at the trailing 12 month? Are you looking at an average of the last 3 years? Are you looking at a future run rate EBITDA or a forecasted? Or are you looking at the EBITDA that will be of the combined companies and the contribution? So it's certainly everybody's always talking about multiples now, but I think that's too simplistic.
And kind of to complement Tom, you and I spend probably most of our careers in the market. So we're looking at market-based valuations, and that's where the trends really, support higher valuations, but then also the risks, right? If you have a very positive trend, but only one customer, wow, it may be really difficult to get that 13-time multiple or that 10-time multiple or that 8-time multiple because all we have is really we're working based on Jonathan's wins if Jonathan is our customer. From a floor value, we always use the asset value. And you see that again, heavy equipment, contractors, usually you kind of go into the market saying, hey, we know what our equipment value is, what our liquidation value of the equipment is, our receivables, our jobs in process, et cetera. That's kind of the floor you're seeing, especially those contractors, working in the infrastructure space. So think data centers, the electrification of America and things of that nature. They are getting higher multiples than they have received, in years past. So it's much greater than an asset value. But and those are
I'll follow up with Jonathan on this one. How have private equity and leverage lending funds, which are, and a lot of private credit, which are kind of newer developments, affected business valuations and M&A activity?
Well, I'll answer your question. I don't want a misconception that I'm talking about like in the last 6 weeks or last 6 months, right? But generally speaking, over the last 6 years, over the last 26 years, the presence of private equity in the market and lenders in the market, I mean, generally speaking, it is increased demand for businesses to buy. There's a lot of money on the street.
Yeah.
The business of a private equity fund is to buy and sell companies. So the existence of that means more demand. That means higher multiples. The existence and presence of leveraged lending funds. They facilitate more aggressive deal structures because the acquisitions can be fueled by more debt. So they support higher, dollar offers for deals. This in turn, again, not necessarily the last, 6 months, but over a longer period of time, has created an easier exit for sellers because there is a market. It's like you can make an analogy to buying and selling big cap stocks versus, penny stocks that are very thinly traded. And the other thing, and this circles back to the concept that you brought up much earlier today, the hybrid buyer, where sure, it's a fund backed company, but the fund backed company, the concept of a platform company. So a private equity fund might have bought, just make something up, a concrete manufacturer, but then over the 12 years ago, and then over the course of the proceeding 12 years through today, with the support of the private equity fund, that concrete company may have made, 6 acquisitions of its own. Now, whether they're owned directly by the original portfolio company, or if they're owned directly by the private equity fund, that's not that relevant to my point. The point is that the phenomenon drives consolidation, i.e. roll-ups.
Excellent answer, Jonathan. All right, so here's Greg, a softball for you, but it's when does a seller need to hire an intermediary?
Yeah, I always say, if they're serious about going into the market, they should have some sort of market professional, an investment banker, intermediary, business broker, depending on the size of the company representing them. Basic, answer there is you want to have as broad of an outreach as possible. Ideally, you'd like to have someone that has the market experience and, the contacts within your strategic space and your competitive landscape to talk to a variety of players. Your job as the business owner, really is to focus on the business so that the business continues its positive trends, not really focusing on the process. Because the process is a full-time job in itself. And Tom, when we run processes, you and I both, it's not a solo person process. We have a team helping us, putting together the materials and things of that nature. So we really want the business owner to stay focused on their business to maximize that value. But the big reasons for hiring an investment banker is really getting that broad exposure, looking at all the opportunities that are available from a fit perspective, from a strategy perspective, also from a value, but it's not just value, it's also structure, right? And we'll talk about the transaction structure later. And, having someone that has that market experience and has some of the contacts in that space really help the process along significantly.
Yep, and it's getting over, one thing I've learned early from certain mentors is that every single deal is going to have breaking points at somewhere along the line. So you negotiate an LOI and both of you seem to be in agreement, but time moves on and things change. And people thought they understood something, even in writing, but they really didn't understand it. And so then the deal is going to break. And it's the real part where I say an investment banker earns their fee is how they bring the parties back together during these breaking points, because they are going to happen. And it's also preventing the breaking points. So that's something that intermediaries do. And that's what we were talking about at the beginning. That's why we want to do the phase ones early and have appraisals. That's why we want the books and records to be in good shape so that these things that could derail the transaction at the end are just kind of nothing because you've taken care of them early on. But
if we do our job right, we like to have a full data room really ready and available at the start of the process that we use to kind of draft the SIM and things of that nature. Tom, real quick though, the question I always get, from folks is, when do I use a business broker versus say an investment banker? And I always say, investment bankers tend to be those professionals that will work on transactions, say, let's say 10 million and above. Your business broker is more Main Street businesses, and we can kind of use a cutoff of 10 million and below, and maybe smaller than that. But I'm not the one to represent, the corner laundromat, nor are you. I would recommend a business broker, and there's professionals that do that. But if it's a business of, emerging scale, I'm not talking distress, because both Tom and Jonathan work on a lot of distress as well, and that is an asset class that is coming back. I was just talking today with a client that had a covenant breach, so they're
Well,
dealing with that. But what are your thoughts regarding the break point and the differences between,
I
obviously
think
other
it's,
than the
I think
licenses?
I think it's somewhat semantics. I don't, there might be a technical definition like investment bank, like we're licensed with FINRA to sell
Yes.
securities and then could do capital raises legally or IPOs. But generally, if we're talking about sell side, I find that it's really about the same. It's just that business brokers tend to work on smaller deals and investment bankers larger deals, but they're kind of the same. I do find that the term investment banker actually within the general public is pretty well misunderstood. So you sometimes have to explain. Just yesterday I had a call with a prospect, and they were convinced we were an equity firm. Because the investment bankers, people put in their mind, they think of Goldman Sachs and they think of Morgan Stanley and they think of, people putting money to work. And that's one aspect. Investment banks have several different things that they do, one of which is business brokerages. So I almost think we'd be better served if we were a little bit straightforward about what we do, because that's what we're an intermediary that is, aligning with the seller to work for them to get the best price.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, well, I'm going to take the other side, and I'll let Phil kind of chime in here. Are there pitfalls to consider with working with an incentive-based professional?
Tom, I'm going to redirect your question just a little bit.
Sure.
And I think instead of pitfalls, I think really what we're talking about here is the need to understand the agreement you're entering into and what the service is going to be, and negotiate what you want it to be.
Yep.
As opposed to a pitfall, because while we could talk about pros and cons of incentive-based anybody, it really gets back to what are your expectations? What's the agreement? Do you understand it? What are the details? Is it going to achieve the purpose you want to achieve? And a minute ago, Greg used the 10 million level. I would say in some instances, don't y'all agree, it's the type business too, because you could have a startup that has just great exponential potential and they need an investment banker, but they could be a $5 million business. But when you start looking at what they're doing and the technology that they're using, they really need the expertise. And it gets back to, if you can find somebody that has the expertise in the industry of the business you're trying to sell, and they don't have conflicting interest. And I just think we set those aside because most people are going to disclose those. And again, that's getting back to knowing what you're getting in agreement. So from that standpoint, I think look, I like to use the analogy. If you're paying a real estate agent $100 to sell your $500,000 house, they're going to give you $100 worth of service. If you're going to give them a commission for selling it, they're going to try to sell it harder. And I think that's true with just about any professional. To some level, there ought to be some incentive to get people to work to really find the best buyer. There ought to be upside for everybody. And that gets back to the details of the agreement. And that's why I would say, understand it, not necessarily pitfalls, just understand what you're getting into and make sure that that's what you were really expecting?
Well, Phil, I totally, and I'm going to elaborate on one point. It's that what we find important is to make sure that our incentives are aligned with what the seller wants to happen. So as an example, sometimes we do both debt raises and we do equity raises. And the standard is for debt raises to be at a lower percentage than than to bring in equity or a sale. But a lot of times in situations we're involved with, the seller or would prefer debt. They would to a sale. So we can be at a perverse incentive, and we're more incentivized for doing something that the seller doesn't want. And so we're very big on, and we're being creative about it. And maybe it's not always market, but we like to be aligned. So we'll have those at the same amount so that we don't have some kind of false incentive that we're going. And we like to also have that our involvement has a positive ROI. So one thing that you see with business brokers and others is they have something for their fees are sent on something called the Lehman formula. And so it's like it's a very high percentage on the first million, like 10% even, and then it kind of comes down as you go. So the more they get, the lower they are. We like to go the opposite because sometimes it's like anybody could fall off a log and sell a business for 15 million. You could just sell your assets for that. Whereas running a great process that really gets competition and gets this number that nobody can expect it, we feel that's a windfall. And so we say, let's get a higher amount for this. So now we're incentivized to deliver what they really want. So that's one
That
thing.
goes back
A good
to
point.
understanding the agreement and making sure that it does, that you're right, that the interests parallel, because again, if you've got assets that you're carving out and they're going back to the shareholder, but the ultimate percentage was based off return to the shareholder, well, the shareholders are always going to get the excluded assets, so it shouldn't be part of the fee. But you've just got to understand that. And if that's what you agree to, and that's what maximized your value for the rest of the business, because there were excluded assets that helped do that, then maybe it should be paid on that. My whole deal is the only time I ever see a problem is when somebody really hadn't looked at it and studied it and don't understand what they've entered into with the people they've hired to help them achieve their goal.
Well, that certainly happens.
Yeah, I agree.
Go ahead, Greg.
No, I just said I agree with Phil in that regard.
Okay, let me, I'm going to answer this. Are professional intermediaries more about finding buyers or investors, or are they more about advising and documenting? Okay, and now, first of all, I would say that they're not about documenting. That's really something that lawyers are really should be relied on for that. They can have input, but then between advising and again, like we're saying on this webcast, it's a lot about advising people how to prepare, putting the materials together, how to run a process, how to control that process. Finding buyers, and I'll throw this out, might not be agreed upon by all, but I think that's somewhat overrated in a sense, because what I find is a lot of people pitch, oh, I know these buyers in your industry, you know, I know the big buyer. And I find that the easiest part of a process actually is finding buyers. If you've got an asset to sell and you're marketing it right, you're going to find a way to get that in front of the right buyers and make sure that they're competing. So actually having a friendship with those buyers, that can actually work against a seller. And I think they sometimes have to be concerned. A lot of people come in and say, oh, we're an industry specialist. Look, we just did 5 deals with this market leader. Well, if I'm a seller, I should be concerned. I might be fish food for this bigger fish. I'm not. So what the truth is the way buyers are found is a multiple way. So we look at, you know, basically a couple different ways of finding buyers. And the first way we look at is we do research on these databases that have become ubiquitous amongst investment bankers called PitchBook, CapIQ, and there's others. But then we find anybody that's interested in the private equity or strategics that have an interest in this type of company. Then we work with the seller themselves and their industry, because they generally know who's in the industry and who's going to want it. And then we work with industry resources and find out, who are the people within this industry that should be buyers. And then the third thing we do is we work with our own proprietary database of investors. Now, this helps more on the distressed deals, but on the general deals, as much as we advertise and we have such a broad Rolodex and contacts with buyers, the truth is almost never do those people end up being the actual buyers. Generally ends up being somebody in the industry that has the most interest and value in that company.
And the key is vetting the buyers, because what we find is there are a plethora of private equity and financial buyers and family offices. And, some of them, they want to see every single deal that we're looking at. But we also track, how many deals that we showed Tom, did they actually, commit to formalizing an indication of interest? Did the indication of interest translate into a letter of intent? Did the letter of intent translate into a closing? So having some of those data points really does help. But you're absolutely right, Tom. I think the fun part of the process is really getting creative at the beginning in terms of what does that buyer pool look like, and who are the strategic folks, and how can you creatively find, tangent strategies that will be attractive in the industry for your client to kind of expand that pool of possible suitors.
Well, I'm going to ask one last question, and this is kind of the last kind of sale thing. And then next week we'll come back and we're going to hit a lot of stuff about during the whole process and getting from start to close. But the last thing to Jonathan is for like capital investments, like infrastructure investment, does it make sense leading into a sale to make those type of investments, or should you defer them?
Depends.
That's right.
It really depends. What's the timing on the ROI? What's the buyer's expectations? Smart CapEx can improve valuation. But again, I make the analogy that a few of us have made. What we do is not rocket science, and analogizing to getting ready to sell your house is not a bad analogy.
Right.
Everybody who has ever looked it up knows that, improving a bathroom is probably a good use of money. Putting a pool in is a terrible use of money. Not everybody views a pool as a positive.
That's right.
And leaving aside, of course, the fact that if you want to sell in 3 months and the pool's going to take 4 months to build, that's a problem. So I'll stop where I started. It depends.
Yeah,
Well,
Tom, what I
yeah.
would also say is, does the CapEx sustain the business in terms of where they're currently performing and where their current projection is? If it's needed to sustain where they're currently at and to, provide modest growth, usually it's a good investment that you have to make. Most buyers don't want to come into a company where, there has been an awful neglect of everything from infrastructure to hiring the right personnel with things of that nature. It does discount the value. If you're providing for, the next 10 years of growth, it might be best to kind of do that with a partner or the next generation of the company, and talk about, things that could be done that may or may not need to be invested in if the acquirer has already made those investments.
Well, these are great answers, and I think that's right. That a lot of times a buyer, it's like with Jonathan's analogy, like, should you fix the kitchen? Well, maybe they'd rather have a credit and have their own taste in what's going to happen. But on the other hand, there are some smaller investments that are worthwhile. So we find that just if you're going to have buyer visits and the plant is dirty and it's got low lighting and it has broken things, it's worth investing to have it look a lot better and clean up. Those things might not be large investments, but it's going to help the company show better, because impressions make a big difference. And I'm going to end it right there. There's so much more to cover, so I'm sure it's like a cliffhanger to come back next week and hear this next part that will get us through the transaction, all the way, the APA, the letter of intent, closing. It's going to be super exciting. But I want to thank all the panelists. I want to thank our sponsors. I want to thank Financial Ploys for giving us the opportunity to educate on what we all love to do. And that's it for this week. We'll look forward to seeing as many of you next week.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank y'all. Have a good day.